Before we really start to enter into the core topic of today, let me give you a bit of context, especially to those of you who might be kind of new to the three projects. So T-Factor, Centrino, and Habin, as you may have understood, are different Horizon projects. But what we really have in common is a common mission, because we responded already 3 years ago, I think, to the same Horizon call, which basically means that we have this ambition of developing and exploring viable strategies and approaches to urban regeneration in ways that unleash entrepreneurship, culture and creativity, social inclusion and innovation. So somehow we have this type of impact to somehow contribute to in common. But somehow we, of course, have different types of angles and perspectives and research questions in mind. So here really you can see a very kind of overview of these three projects. As you can imagine, these are all kind of super complex in terms of scale, in terms of intervention plans, the type of partnership they have. But to give you really a short idea, so T-Factor is heavily focused on the topic of temporary uses and urban regeneration and how these practices can accelerate time to impact. And our focus is especially on the topic of inclusion, social inclusion and social innovation. Then we have Centrino, which has instead a focus more on alternative economies that are locally rooted and citizens-led. So they're also exploring how, for example, Fab Labs, maker spaces, and innovation hubs can be drivers of these novel models of economies in cities. And last but not least, we have Habin, where the focus is more on heritage. Sorry, can you mute your mix? Thank you. The focus is more on heritage, culture, and creativity, and how these three aspects can help us revitalize historic urban areas. So we are basically exploring different types of practices, working with different types of spaces and in many different cities. And this is, I think, is the unique feature that we have in terms of collaborating across these three projects. I think more than 1 year ago, we released a common manifesto and roadmap, which basically summarizes and articulates the key principles and values that we share across the three projects. And more than that, there is a roadmap that somehow articulates a number of common moments that we want to have throughout our journey in order to compare and contrast and discuss the multiple challenges that we are facing in the projects. As you can see from this small map, we are working all across Europe somehow. So more, I think that around 30 cities involved from different cultures, geographies of different sizes. So again, this is kind of a unique opportunity to understand and to compare what works and what doesn't in different contexts. So the topic of today, as you know, is about impact, and it's kind of what we call the hot potato, right? Because despite our own focus and ambitions and what we really want to achieve, this is what we at the end need to prove, right? What is the impact on the ground that through these projects we want to unlock? And indeed, it's kind of, I would say, the elephant in the room most of the time, because of course we have high ambitions, but then there is the reality, right? So we already had the chance to somehow surface the many different challenges that we have. So for example, what types of indicators, how we make impact measurement feasible and sustainable in such long projects and complex projects. So today really is our moment to go a bit deeper into what challenges we have, what type of solutions we are trying to explore in order to do better and to improve over time. And we would like to do so from a more, let's say, practical perspective. So really understanding what type of tools and approaches the three projects are exploring. The program, as you can see, is very simple. So Maro Pantasidou, that is here with us, and thanks a lot, Maro, for accepting the invitation, will spark the discussion today. And then we will have Alex from Centrino, Chris from Habin, and Ignas and Rashita from T-Factor responding a bit to Maro's inputs and insights. However, this is not meant to be, let's say, a closed conversation. So we really welcome feedbacks, questions, reflections from all the attendees. Maybe one recommendation is to use the raise hand function in Zoom, and my colleague Dario will help me facilitate the flow. Dario, maybe you can show up so that people can see you.
Here I am. Yes, I will try also to collect your questions in the chat if you have the questions. So yeah, or otherwise you can raise your hand. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we really start. Just let me give you a bit introduction about Maro. So Maro is PhD candidate at the University of York. Her research explores the politics of time and care and how we can reimagine these in a work-based societies. Thinks this would deserve another webinar, Maro, so maybe we should think about that. She also practices strategy making with social justice organization and activists, and was previously head of global impact and learning at Amnesty International. So I think the focus that we are having today, and of course Maro will tell us more in a minute, is really about how we can leverage impact assessment, not only to somehow measure results, but really for strategic learning and capacity building. So with this said, thank you all for coming today. I hope the discussion will be interesting and fruitful. I'm sure it will do so. And Maro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the perfect introduction. Everyone, really great to be here with you today. Give me just 1 second to do that common thing of sharing screens and hope it goes well. Give me just a second. Otherwise, we have a backup plan. Here we are. Great. Can you all see a flower-inspired slide?
Yes, Maro, of course.
Okay, so we'll jump right in. So the question for today is, how does change happen? And transformative change at that. And how do we know? So this is the question underlying anything I'm going to share with you today as per way of sparking this conversation. And actually, it's the question, or should be the question, that motivates any impact framework or methodology for impact assessment. So the first thing is that all of us have different assumptions or preconceptions about how change happens. And I've put here for you a bit of a meme. I hope that the Zoom things don't obstruct your viewing of the slides. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. Only yours.
Right. True. Yeah, so I've put here a bit of a meme that was going around a couple of years ago for you that contrasts two assumptions about how change happens. One approach or assumption that says that change happens when people take the streets and disrupt normality as we know it, including sometimes with violent means. And another approach that says that no, change happens when people take the fields and create different ways of life together. And each of these approaches would have certain assumptions about what power is and what does it mean to address the power that is above us or to create power together. And I'm really using this here just as an example. In fact, one could swap this around and argue for the opposite, or any other picture there about how we think change happens. And most of people, like the people I'm assuming are gathered here today, that we have some experience with activism or civic action or broader social change projects. We are all already painfully familiar with the fact that change needs multiple approaches all at once. It's very rare in history that we will find a big transformative change that will have come about only through one pathway. So we do already know that, but it still remains true that most of us will have a preference for one approach over the other. Some people will favor more approaches to change that focus on the change of lifestyles of everyday life, or approaches that favor the changes of laws and legal systems, or that favor the idea of changing deeper values and ideologies that run through society. And that depends on many times on our personal history, the country or the region we have grown up, the way history has evolved, where we've come, the lessons we have about, even from school, right? And this is not just personal, but then it extends to whole organizations that actually adopt one approach to change more than other, which is not necessarily a problem, even if one organization says this is the only way we're going to go about it. It's a problem when we're not aware that this is the way we're using, or we cannot reflect on the way we're using. And then that kind of brings me, I guess, then to, has the slide changed? Yes. To this other, I think, much more enchanting view of this green scenery, where up there towards the sun is this big change we wish to see. And then we know there are many paths to be walked to get there, right? And the second thing maybe I want to say here is the one is to know what are the multiple paths, or to be able to imagine and sketch these different paths. The other thing that we commonly see is that we might know what is up there, like the big thing. We want to see more citizen-led economies, just to use one of the examples from the manifestos that Laura shared before. And we might know what are some of the first steps we want to take that are there in the beginning of the green fields. Like we might want to write a manifesto about this, or we might want to create a training about it. But then it gets a bit more complicated there, where you see all these different valleys and reefs and cleavages, like what happens until we get to the change we want to see. And that's where I always remember this cartoon, which is so old school and still one of my favorites, where you see this equation there that says, this is step 1 and this is step 5. And then it says, yeah, but around there in step 2, a miracle occurs. And maybe we should try and be more explicit about what happens there in the middle. And this is the thing I like to call the missing middle in social change. So what we see many times is a certain level of clarity, we will get to that in a bit, about the big changes, like the citizen-led economy or a circular economy, and a certain level of specificity around the activities. And then we're not very sure about how to connect our everyday activities with these bigger long-term changes that I think also Laura mentioned in the beginning. So in summary, for that let's say little spark introduction, what I'm trying to say is that organizing for transformative social change means at least many more things as well. Being aware of our assumptions and being able to be transparent about these assumptions, testing multiple paths, and being really imaginative in finding interventions for this missing middle I was just talking about. For the kind of activities, it's more than activities really, right? It's whole interventions, I think is the right word, that can set things in motion. I think many times, or instead, the common pitfalls, the common problems we see in organizations or in movements, or at least in my experience, obviously I'm talking subjectively here, are the following. The one is that there are tensions in teams, within teams, because there's a lack of clarity exactly of these paths, of these theories for change. So many times, I've sat in meetings, facilitating workshops where people overtly or covertly disagree about putting more of their energy into running educational programs or putting more energy in doing advocacy towards, let's say, the mayor. And what's happening there is that they haven't had an open discussion or reflection about how do we think change happens and why. Because the ways we believe change happens is the tools, the vehicles through which we decide to dedicate our resources. And by resources, I don't mean only money, obviously, right? I mean, our time, our energy, and even most importantly, our hope, our faith of where do we get the motivation to go on. So sometimes we see tensions that are really tensions because we haven't had these reflections. The second and the third problem that we see when it comes to impact and strategy are my favorite. The one is this problem I call here of increased awareness. So I'm sure you've all read many project documents beyond these 3 projects. And in these 3 projects that talk about increased awareness, greater social inclusion, greater participation, okay, but how does this look like in practice? So a key thing of having an impact approach is being able to break down this increased something, like this beautiful vision that sits at the top of the mountain, in how will it look like? So if we indeed have a circular economy, and the question here is, who will be doing what? The mayor will be doing this, the citizen associations will be doing that, our infrastructures will, and we'll get to that in a second, right? To be able to break this down. And the third, it's not exactly a problem, let's say an issue here, is what has been discussed in the world, mostly of NGOs and environmental human rights organizations, as vanity metrics. Vanity is too harsh of a word, maybe. But what we're talking about here is when, for our impact analysis, we mainly or only use quantitative metrics that in some way are trying to show that we're doing well. And just to give an example, those can be numbers of people who attended a workshop, or numbers of press releases we issued in this year, or numbers of reports, or likes on our Instagram posts, or even funds we've raised through our fundraising efforts. Obviously, nothing's wrong with any of these, and probably they're necessary. The issue is when we overuse this kind of metrics as a way to show that we have done things, or as a way of push towards our funders that we have done things, because of a lack of more meaningful metrics that can show us we're actually advancing these paths, we're walking this path towards a greater goal. And we will look in a bit, and I'm sure through the conversations and the presentations of today, what meaningful metrics could be or can look like. And just take a breath. Yeah, sorry, I tend to talk fast sometimes. I hope it's okay. And so what did we do back when I worked in Amnesty? And please you don't need to try and read through all these colorful boxes. We tried first to support the teams we were working with, systematize their approach to change. So lose this, and then a miracle happens step. So this is a theory of change from one of the projects back when I was working at Amnesty. And the main thing actually to focus your attention to right now is this middle part. So as you see on the one side, it says, what are the changes we wish to see? At the other side says what we can do. But in the middle is being able to identify the preconditions that will bring these changes about. So these are not the things we can do, but the things that need to happen out there, the things that need to be set in motion so that we can see the changes, right? So those can be things, yeah, we need more specific kind of resources that are lacking in our city, or specific kinds of infrastructure, or the will of our political bodies, or specific legal enabling changes that can lead us to the more circular economy. And please here, just an asterisk, if I'm in any way misrepresenting the work around urban regeneration here, please excuse me, it's not my field, but I have been very lucky and grateful to learn things about this from Laura and Alex, and hopefully from others in this call today. So when I worked in Amnesty back in 2013, we had an impact and learning team that we had to come up with reporting mechanisms. And I'm actually very proud to say that working with wonderful people in the space of about 5 years, this impact and learning team became the global program of strategy, and where I was then the head of impact and learning. And why was that? Because we moved from a culture of reporting, of vanity metrics, to trying to create a culture of strategy, of thinking, what are the preconditions that will bring about the changes? So the first way of thinking or tool we try to change in the culture is to have transparent theories of change, like the one I'm showing you now. And then I'm going to share very briefly in headings, what are some of the lessons, or what are some of the things, the tools, the methods we created for more than 600 human rights projects across the world. So this is just a thing to say, this was also complex. And like the 3 projects here today, each strand of work involved many, many mini projects underneath. And so just to use some headings here that mostly come from the outcome mapping methodology that especially Centrino colleagues will be familiar with or have heard of. And yeah, I'll just go straight to the others. So some of the ways of thinking that are involved in an outcome mapping approach, or in generally, I would say, creating an impact framework, is to understand the types of changes you want to put in motion. right? So it goes back again to this having greater inclusion. To what does greater inclusion look like? The other is to understand like what are the different actors, the types of actors we want to influence. Because in an outcome mapping approach, which is also, as I think Alex will say more, what Centrino is using, the belief is that change happens through shifts in attitudes, behaviors, and actions of specific actors and networks. That change happens through relationships, through concrete people, concrete networks and institutions shifting their approach, and that this can be observable and documentable in a form that is more qualitative, right, than quantitative. So we almost really created lists of the different actors, which in the case of Amnesty were different governments, different ministries, different local authorities, different social movements for human rights. And we created lists of types of changes, like a minister signs a decree, like very concrete changes. The good thing in this case is that human rights as a network of organizations is more than 60 years old today, right? It started after the Second World War and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So different struggles, different language, and different repertoire of action. You have many years of struggles. So you could then sit down and say, what types of outcomes, what types of changes have we been achieving these 60 years? Can we write them down in a menu, in a way where people can understand and use this and think, what am I trying to achieve? And what type of actors are we targeting? So obviously, fields that have to do with urban regeneration and urban equality will use different changes and will target different actors. And then it's this concept of progress markers, which says like basically how much change is enough. And normally one of the ways this is organized is to think of this expect like love approach of knowing within a year, what do we expect to see, what would we like to see, and what would we love to see. So I'll go back to this mayor example I said. Instead of saying increased awareness of the mayor about, for example, creative hubs around the city, is saying that what we expect to see is that the mayor will start answering our calls or our emails. And what we would like to see is that actually she or he come down and pay a visit to one of the maker spaces and see what this really is about. And what we would love to see is that they will commit to funding 2 more maker spaces, right? So that gives you a sense of like, how do I think I'm going to walk this journey? And then, of course, the last part of this is having an analysis of tactics. So let's say we have reached our love to see 2 years down the line, and the mayor has committed to funding 3 creative and learning hubs in the city. Which interventions made this happen? Was it something actually we did? Was it we sent too many emails until they couldn't handle us anymore? Did we do it through another influence route? Did we get some journalists to do actually bad publicity for the mayor not paying attention in the need for a green transition? How did we make this happen, right? So that we don't get stuck in vanity metrics of saying, you know, we issued 5 press releases. Maybe it wasn't the press releases that made this happen. And I'll say, and then in a bit I'll say, but why do we need to know all this? So by working in this way, this is just an example of the types of changes that were relevant for human rights, right? Changes in activism, in policies, and we would break this down in many more categories of changes. And this is more related to what I just said of the mayor example, and it's using our impact analysis to understand our circles of influence and control. So actually this, what you see in front of you right now is the theory of change mapped reversely. So that we, down there in the red circle, is our circle of control, is what we can do. You know, we can organize the meeting, we can call the mayor, we can do the training, we can develop a new methodology. And the yellow up there, our goals, is our circle of interest. Like we actually want the mayor to commit to that funding. This is where we hope to get. This is what the change we wish to see. The real work happens in the blue, right? It's like, who are the actors that are within our reach that we can influence to influence the mayor, in a way to put it like that, which could be the journalists I mentioned earlier, or it could be a citizens association that is particularly powerful in our city. And again, disclaimer, I'm using a particular way of thinking about change here, right? A way that says that change happens through powerful figures, the mayor, making powerful choices. This is an assumption, right? I could start with a completely different theory of change and say, we're going to find the money ourselves, and we're going to build the hubs ourselves, and we don't need the mayor, right? I'm not voting for one way or another. I'm just illustrating that everything constantly has to do with our strategic choices. And this is the last thing I'm going to show, a bit like a little snippet of things we were using, which goes back more into this tactics analysis, this activities check. So here you see an example from a very hands-on workshop where on the horizontal axis, you will see the broader changes like media and public perception, community mobilization, and in the vertical axis, you'll see the different activities like sending a delegation to the World Social Forum, doing cinema screening in slums. This was a project in Kenya, doing exchange visits. And then people were using this in a workshop to vote by these dots, which activities actually contributed to which changes. So if we actually did manage to get more media attention, where did we get it from? Did we get it from the exchange visits or from the cinema screens? And how did this happen? Key thing here, do you see that the dots have different colors? Yes. Different people were making these claims, right? So this workshop would have included the people who run the projects, people from the community. If we would get lucky, someone actually from the local authorities that was a friend of the project, and different stakeholders, to use that word, would vote their opinion about how change happened. This is not one person's opinion, right? And this is very important. We'll get back to that in a sec. So in using these tools, I just said, I just walked you through very quickly. Amnesty International at that stage was able to aggregate a lot of interesting patterns of what kind of impact are we having, through which tactics are we having it. And this is not for, for us to look into detail. And also a lot of these documents are internal for the wider network. So I'm a bit reluctant to share them, but I might be able to share by email more. What you see here in the round thing was actually another layer of analysis, which was saying how important was Amnesty International in achieving this change. And although that might not concern these three projects, I just want to quickly say the importance of understanding our own power, right? So one of the questions we would ask in these workshops with people or with our team was, do you think this change would have happened without our intervention? And when people say no, did our work increase the speed? Like things would have happened anyway, but we made them happen faster. Or did it increase the quality? Like it would happen anyway, but that actually happened in a way that was deeper or more sophisticated, or the law passed, that the law is a better law. This is a very honest example because it does a lot of work around legal change. So this is the other use of all that you can actually create these learning tools to aggregate patterns. So in your case, to say a few years from now in Europe, where did we see change? Do we see some kind of changes more often in the South European countries or in the North European countries? Or do we see them more in big cities or in small cities? Like you can create all kinds of higher level patterns, right? And going towards the end of this initial input, maybe trying to summarize, what is an impact framework about based on what I've shared so far? The one is aligning activities to vision. I think that has become clear. Knowing why we're doing what we're doing and not something else that we could be doing. Being able to communicate our approach towards change, and this is so important. Please don't underestimate the importance of taking your theory of change or taking your report of the different outcomes and being able to use that to communicate your work and not necessarily show it as a piece of paper, but be able to talk through it with each other in a team, but also with other partners and stakeholders. Knowing what doing well towards our goal might look like. How do we even know we're doing well? So having some goalposts there, right, to be able to look back. And developing meaningful metrics. And this is, again, like you must have heard this phrase many times, this like, what you measure matters, right? So if you tell a team that what we measure as impact is how many press releases you have per year, just to use an example, then everybody will focus on creating more press releases. But if we tell the same team or agree with the same team that the metric is how many critical questions towards the government on X issue, on refugee issues, did journalists make this year? This is a different metrics. It shows a shift to the debate. It shows that more journalists are taking a critical stance. And maybe we have achieved this through creating one training for journalists instead of issuing 15 press releases. Just saying, this is again, a random example from my own life. And why we want to know all these things? Because we're trying to impact systems. This is the famous system iceberg. You might have seen it in other mobilization documents. Greenpeace has been using it a lot in the past. So many times we observe the upper level, right? The shift in events, like this happened or that happened. But a lot of our work is about being able to observe and hopefully influence the shifts in patterns in society, in structures, and even deeper in values. And to do that, that is the word of caution. To do that, to influence society at a deeper level, everything I've said before, adapted to your project, could be useful. But again, it's a method. There's no such thing as hard science. It's just, we make decisions every month, every moment, every year about our projects. It's just a way of making better decisions, of saying, if we're seeing we're getting more traction with mayors or journalists or disability associations or feminist collectives, and this takes us closer to our goal, why don't we do a bit more of that instead of the other one? It's more about making better decisions. It's really, that's all you can do. You cannot find some perfect truth about how change happened. And the other word of caution is that this is a participatory assessment. That's why I used the example before with the dots. This is not me or Alex or Lara or someone saying, oh, let me think, how did the Paris pilot do this year? There are multiple truths. So many people need to sit together and discuss through those questions. This is the value of it, right? And that's how it becomes a learning process. And again, as I said, it's mapping those patterns of change. There are patterns of change. I'm not being completely postmodern here, like there's no pattern, we never know anything. But we need to map these patterns with a level of care and caution. And to leave you with, again, final question is, and in the end, what is strategy? And for me, strategy is really just adjusting. And as a professor of mine once said, or many people have said now, fail forwards. Like fail a bit better and try again. So if I can leave you with one thing is that all of the efforts around impact is such a fascinating process of trying to understand how change happens. And if we can do a bit more of that through these projects, it will be a real contribution to understanding change and moving away from a culture of reporting for reporting, but a culture of understanding for change. And that's all for now. I hope it was a good beginning to our conversation.
Super beginning. Maro, thanks a lot. I think really you raised a lot of really central questions and really super quickly. I think it all speaks a lot, at least for T Factor. I think we all went through these kind of reflections and problems, especially when it comes to, is it impact or is instead the way we design and think about change, which I think makes completely a huge difference. Okay, so thanks a lot for these. I think we'll have the chance to discuss a bit more. So let's start directly with a bit of reactions from the three projects, and in between projects for all the attendees today, we may start to have questions or kind of feedback. So Alex, Centrino, would you mind start?
Great presentation from Maro, and I'm going to try my best to create some continuity on the points raised with, it's no surprise really that I'm walking along those pathways of thinking, since Maro has been a massive help and support in developing this over-engineered methodology that I will try to cram into a few slides here. So I also prepared a really short presentation of the complex thing that is called Centrino, focusing basically to the dimensions that connect to impact assessment, just to have a shared understanding of what are the things I'm speaking about. So this is the big old framework of the project that we have been discussing for ages. I think Pablo is also here with us today, who's has been relieved from the pressure of making sense of that, but he has done massive work in understanding it and working with people. So this is kind of the pentagon that is drawn around every activity around Centrino, which is building across different key concepts like circularity, heritage, social inclusion. I don't have to go into details about that. I'm going to focus on the three key actions, as we said, on how to mobilize change. Basically, this is basically the theory of change of the project in a nutshell. So the first step is about mapping the local ecosystem and using different tools and methods for that, understand what is there, assess the situation, and so on. And then the second step is about building a community around that. So again, different sets of tools just thrown around here on how you can build a community after you have mapped stakeholders and opportunities and things that connect people together and so on. And then finally, what Centrino wants to achieve in a nutshell is implement FAB city hubs so turn city districts, old industrial heritage sites into the thing that we call a FAB city hub. So it's basically an innovation and creativity hub that allows the FAB city vision to come into place, which is about cities being productive and using regenerative practices to revitalize basically the local economy and break down the global supply chains that can be disrupted and make citizens dependent on global geopolitical situations and so on, plus the increasing ecological costs. So this is kind of a picture of what a FAB city hubs can be abstracted to. So it's leveraging all these different methods, all these different actions, organizing them in specific ways in different contexts in order to bring about a different form of organizing productive resources, basically. So making distributed production, revitalizing crafts and traditional knowledge and so on, in building better lives for the citizens, providing more products and services that the local context needs in ways that they can be included and so on. So this is kind of the overall vision. So the issue here is, how do you assess that? That this is a transformative vision. We're basically speaking of an alternative form of social and political organization, basically, right? So this is a different economic model. These are different practices, different organizational structures. How can we understand whether change happens, as Maro very nicely put it? So a quick and dirty overview of our over-engineered impact assessment methodology is that it focuses on keeping track of three processes of change that happen simultaneously. So the first one is looking at the pilots. As Maro already mentioned, change in the pilots on the local level is understood in terms of changes in behaviors, actions, and relationships. So, and these are changes on behalf of the people, not at the core of the project activities, not us, rather the people that the project directly interacts with and those that we can actually influence. So it's not like the president of the United States, it's more like the deputy second officer of the mayor's office, or the secretary for planning whatever thing. So it's about understanding our reach and trying to basically describe what we would like people to do differently for the change to take place. And how we keep track of that, a bit of technical notes. So we have these spreadsheets that where we try to work with pilot cities to define who the partners are, what are the different types of change that we can achieve, and what are the progress markers in the different areas and so on. And then we're using this what we call them the outcome journals. So to basically at the end of each pilot activities period, we assess in different ways that how well did we do with the progress markers? Did change happen or not? And what kind of change did we achieve? So this is understanding change on the local level. The second process is about the project's platforms actions, tools, and resources, basically. So this is looking at the tactics. So, okay, we observed some change, we planned it, something happened, we can prove it has happened, but how much did the project contribute to this change? What are the resources that the project provides for the change to happen, and what does this mean at the end of the day? So does it lead to anything different, or is it just we threw some different fancy graphics and something happened and then it will die out? So here we're trying to basically connect the outcomes that the pilots plan on this hand side with the different actions planned by the project resources. We're focusing to some platforms through which most of the pilots mostly interact, but it basically encapsulates the different resources that the project provides in terms of access to mapping of stakeholders, understanding local heritage, building different methods for change, and so on. And finally, this in-between level, the green sphere, is connecting on one hand to the pilot level, and then it leads us to the third space, which is the project's impact as a whole. And being aware of the project's theory of change, the project's impact is about developing these capacities to implement the thing we call Fab City Hubs. And Fab City Hubs are an emerging concept that we understand and make sense of together with the pilots that actually develop that. So it is not about change that we can observe. So it's not about that we know what a Fab City Hub feels and looks and we can measure that. We know what a Fab City Hub is supposed to do to city reality. So what we can observe is the organizational practices that are built around that. So we have defined a list of 10 organizational practices that characterize what we understand as a Fab City Hub, that are broad enough to provide an example. This practice here is about engagement with institutions and experimenting with new institutions, creating connections with different actors and functions and so on. So this is a broad enough category, but then it characterizes a specific function of the space for the city. And what we do is we try to make connections to different tools of the resources that the project provides to build these capacities, and then go all the way to the practices of the pilots and say, okay, how did the pilots use these tools, and how does this inform that this kind of practice has been established? So for instance, here we see that in the process of engaging with institutions or building new ones, some capacities are about networking and mapping the local stakeholders, know what there is about, and then addressing different audiences and being inclusive in the community. And finally, for each practice, we note down different performance indicators. So we end up to making some measurement at the end, which is, for instance, since it is about mapping stakeholders and networking, so how many stakeholders did we map, or how many did we reach? How many of them came to our events, and how many of them were in vulnerable social groups, and so on? And we're listing different resources of the project that can provide this evidence. So at the end of the day, one might ask, so why do we over-engineer this whole thing if we are to develop vanity indicators at the end of the day? So what is the difference? For me, the key difference here is that we know what we measure, and we measure what we influence, and here we know better what we want to influence. So we're not suggesting that measurement and indicators are a bad thing categorically. It's just that we should be aware of what the indicators indicate. And here what they indicate is the degree at which we're developing these capacities for change, rather than a specific change that the project has somehow achieved. So it's not just about, an indicator could be CO2 emissions over a period of time. So we have a measurement before the project, after the project, and we see change that happened, or reduction of CO2. But reduction of CO2 is connected to specific economic activities, and what are these activities and how did we influence them? So this is the point of the measurement, really.
Alex?
And yes?
Alex, sorry, I need to ask you to speed up. Sorry for that.
No, I'm finishing. I have like 3 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So yeah, we're at this situation of the project where we're finishing our first interim report, so it's exciting times that to see whether this whole thing makes any sense. And I've noted down 3 hot potatoes to summarize in the discussion. So first one is what I call getting thick with data. So we're gathering data, we're documenting different results and so on, but what does this say about the whole situation? And a starting point is that we see data as traces of human activity. So they're not abstract resources that we gather from the skies or we mine from the mountain. These are things that people did, and they're carry along with them, all the imperfections and vices of people, and we should understand them as such. So data alone do not really tell the true story. So what we try to do with the impact assessment is to go from data to developing stories that organize this data in a meaningful manner that carries along the context and the relationships that people have there. And finally, what we want to do is turn these stories into practices that can be transferred around. So we had these results, we're gathering the data, we interpret that, we have the human stories, and then how can this be used in a different context? How can we transfer that? And this is where the Fab City Hub Toolkit is a key resource of Centrino, which basically tries to organize the experience of using different tools, documenting different results so that they can be taken up in different fields. The second hot potato is this great tension between control and emergence. Maro already touched upon that, so we need to acknowledge the boundaries of our action. So in the outcome mapping lingo, actors are called boundary partners because these are the people in an organization operating at the boundaries of our control. So working with them basically means that for the change we want to achieve, it often means losing this control. So we need to influence people to self-organize in different ways that we can no longer control, but we should monitor. And here is where the big problem comes, that reporting needs accuracy. So we need, for change to happen, we need to lose control, but to report on the change, we need to maintain some control. So there's a fine balance in between and how you include people and so on. And here's where it connects with the hot potato number 1. So we try to document everything there is to document, make sense of that through different ways, and finally releasing the thing for the people to take it up and use it. And we report on this process. And this showcases that change has been influenced by the project, but then again, the project is not supposed to be this despotic structure of authority that makes everything change. And finally, I really like how we called the name of this workshop in our last consortium meeting, the hubs they are changing. So there is an issue with observing the development of the thing we call Fab City Hubs while we're making sense of that. So we're planning change while we're monitoring it. And the problem with change is that, when change happens, things are different and you don't know how they're going to be different. So you cannot plan ahead how you're going to monitor and report on that. So there's this dynamic situation that you have to readjust your tactics and methodologies all the time. So one way to approach that is that instead of focusing on the change, how things are different, we're focusing on capacities for change. So what we can document and monitor is how did people develop different skills, access to spaces, infrastructures, and these kinds of things. And then it can lead to different outcomes, but we don't really know what these outcomes can be. We can assume we have this theory of change, but at the end of the day, we have to look at it. And this is where the organizational practices come into play. So we have this broad idea of who is doing what in the ideal world we want to build, and then we let go of these changes to take place by and for the people, and the people being everyone that may use the things we're developing. So yeah, I hope this hasn't been too dense, and yeah, up to you, Laura.
Thanks a lot. So, guys, time-wise, I think we should speed up a bit. So unless there is a super, let's say, pressing question that some people wants to make to Alex, and I will really give you 2 minutes to do that, I would kindly ask all the people to hold on with questions until the end of this round so that we can have more time to really make questions and answers. So maybe, Chris, you want to quickly go through Abin?
So thanks, Lara, and thanks to the speakers. It's so interesting, and looking forward to the discussion. So I'll just put it in presentation mode, then we'll crack on. So hi everyone, my name's Chris. I lead the monitoring and evaluation work package for Hubin, and I'd like to talk very briefly about Hubin's objectives, just for the context of the impact assessment, our approach to it, and then the challenges and learnings that we've found to date. So, very briefly, what is Hubin? This is the official vision: to promote the urban transformation and regeneration of historic urban areas, using as the main catalyst innovation and entrepreneurship, whilst also preserving the unique identity regarding cultural and social values. So it is very much trying to help create a bright future while still remaining true to the cultural past and the communities that made that a place. Regarding historic urban areas, we've got 8 brilliant cities across Europe. Regarding innovation and entrepreneurship, our wonderful work package 2 colleagues in Utrecht University have put forward an entrepreneurial ecosystem, and it's all the foundational elements that build that capacity that can unlock heritage as the engine of innovation and entrepreneurship. You can see a few of the key elements there, so fundamental to Hubin. And each of the 8 cities are currently designing and soon to launch between 3 and 4 interventions that will tackle those elements, and also around safeguarding the cultural and social values, try to tackle these 3 Hubin clusters: the creative and cultural industries, resilient and human connected places, which has a strong environmental angle, and new lifestyles, which has a much more social angle about ways of living. And then, of course, I'm just talking about monitoring. My brilliant colleagues in other work packages on Hubin are supporting the cities with everything from knowledge sharing networks to co-creation toolkits to innovative finance and governance guides, and a lot more than I can summarize. But this is hopefully just to set the flavor. Our approach to impact assessment touches on some of the points people have raised. We do use theory of change. For each city intervention, we do want to map out what are the links between the challenges being addressed, the outputs expected, and the outcomes, the benefits in the short term and the long term across different stakeholder groups. So we do explore a balance of what we call process metrics and impact metrics. And we have some challenges, as everyone else has shared as well. We'll talk through some of the adaptations of how to go about this. But process metrics are often kind of basic figures, the easy numbers to collect. And the reason why some of those are still important on Hubin is for the sense of scale and effectiveness of delivery. So it might be simple things like the number of events held around culture, or the number of co-creators involved from, formerly disenfranchised communities. And again, that's pretty basic data to collect. The challenge, as some of the speakers have touched on, is how meaningful is that? So what? If you held some events, what's really the outcome? Is it building capacity? Is it driving any change? So we also explore, again, we'll touch on some of the challenge of these, but Hubin's big on increasing cultural awareness. For example, if there are events, is it really driving awareness? And what does that lead to? If there are co-creators from disenfranchised communities, is it really changing the feelings of belonging and the sense of place or civic participation or pride? And then in the theory of change for hubbing, ultimately that gives the indication of travel towards the bigger picture change, which is always very challenging for these kind of projects to measure, but like the protection of culture and the building of socially inclusive and cohesive environments. We would add to this, each city is building a hub. It's not static. It's not just one project. It evolves over time with different projects. And so touching a little bit on what former speakers have shared, the whole qualitative angle, besides the indicators, what are we learning in terms of feedback? What's working well? What's not working well? And thanks again to colleagues at Utrecht University, it might be through things like focus groups with key stakeholders to really uncover what are the key barriers preventing change in the hubbing ecosystem, and what are the key opportunities that could be leveraged for the future. As well as basic things like investment, we want to know that the hub will still survive in 2 years, 5 years' time, and won't just end when funding ends. So there are some approaches to this. It's obviously very high level and summary. The final bit about our approach is just how we try to help them through that with a bit of a micro toolkit. Obviously too small to read, but it's just to indicate on the left here, down the bottom, a kind of menu of possible indicators, both quantitative and qualitative. We try to find that balance across economic dimensions, social, cultural, environmental, and some of the underlying foundations as well that move towards those things. In the middle there, again, too small, but just for an idea, we do use theory of change. We want to really test the logic. People have touched on the pathways. If you have a grand goal, a grand vision, what are those different routes that are going to get you there? And which ones are the best ones to focus on, or which ones can we learn from? So we do try to map out those pathways. And then on the right there, again, obviously too small to read, but just as an idea, each priority, let's say outcome or indicator, can be split down and say, okay, what is the quantitative data we want? Is it numbers? Is it proportions? Is it euros? Is it Likert scales, social science techniques about perception? Or is it qualitative? Is it about focus groups and interviews and network intel, and just what time period the cities collect that? So I hope that's okay as a flavor, obviously very summary of the approach and quite generic. I'll touch a little bit on the challenges, if I may, the hot potatoes for impact assessment. The first one is we've got quite a big task as impact assessors, credibly capturing the value that hubbing adds. And again, speakers have already touched on this with brilliant points. I'll just second it from some of the challenges in hubbing and general regeneration as well. Attributing change amidst other projects. These historical urban areas have numerous other programs, investments, strategies, projects, trends. How could you possibly untangle one project over the long term from all these overlapping things? Geographical scale of existing data sets. There's already brilliant data out there on things like driving tourism, if that's one of the aims of the cities, and average spend and so on. But again, hubbing is quite hyper-local. It's about bringing in the communities, and some of them are even at kind of the level of 3 or 4 streets hosting something, so that won't be detectable in the long-term data. Inaccessibility of existing data sets, particularly in the private sector. They might have excellent stuff about revenues and jobs, but obviously it's commercially sensitive. So there's some insights locked out there, depending on who's willing to be part of the network sharing their views. Lack of counterfactual, forgive the jargon. This just means there's no real comparable area to see how that evolves over time, as well as hubbing and compare. And then the long-term nature of regeneration. These projects have very grand ambitions, very worthwhile, things like reversing gentrification or reducing rates of abandonment. But those are very long-term changes and very kind of multi-causal. So we'll just share some of the kind of mitigations to hopefully contribute to the conversation. And some of these are very obvious, but we do apply theory of change, as others have mentioned. You can't measure the end results perfectly in a scientific setting, but you can still determine the direction of travel and how well are you moving towards those things. Generate relevant local data sets. There might be pre and post surveys to particular communities, or we have cultural accelerators on Hubin. So what can we learn from what's working well there? What skills are the businesses developing, and so on. Leverage the intel of key stakeholders. Again, with strong networks, those people will be best placed on the ground to understand what's really working well and what's not contributing. And relatedly, iterative qualitative assessments, understanding and uncovering. We have a vision of change, but what are the barriers? What's stopping us as we go through? And what are those emerging opportunities that we can capitalize on for next year and next year and next year, or the next project, or the next, biannual period, whatever it is? What are those next steps to bring more impact? And so the bottom bullet point, forgive me that I'm kind of just reading off bullet points here, I hope it's okay, but we want to focus on continual improvement. How can those hubs evolve in ways that are meaningful and bring the cities towards their intended outcomes?
Chris, sorry, 3 minutes.
I'm sorry, I thought I had 5 minutes left. Is it 2 minutes, is it, Laura?
3.
3, okay, I can do it in 3, that's right, thank you. Just very quickly then, the bottom 2 quotes, believe it or not, one is a quote from the world of monitoring, probably a few decades ago. If it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. That's just not true, as we know. So we do agree with the theme of the session in the bottom right, improving over proving, and learning rather than trying to take credit. Okay, 2 minutes. Our second hot potato. Given there's so much going on, where do we focus effort? Where do cities focus effort? Is it on movement towards heritage? Is it innovation? Is it social inclusion? Is it entrepreneurial ecosystem? Is it access to finance? Where within there can we focus? And of course, each city has multiple interventions, each with possible things to measure. I'll just skip to the last bullet point there, effort and experience burden. The city teams, even if they weren't responding to global pandemics and lockdowns and geopolitical events, they have a lot on, and sometimes elections, changing municipalities, etc. How do we make it simple to really draw insights? So again, whizzing through, and I'll come to close here. Some of these are very obvious, prioritize indicators, of course, focus on what's important. We do think balance indicators, if we only, or if cities only collect quantitative, they get the basic numbers, but won't get the rich insights that people have touched on. But if they only measure qualitative, there's no insight on the scale or the effectiveness, and there's a lack of an evidence base. So there is a kind of blend of drawing out the meaning. And I'll just bring it to a close here, where just for intel's sake, the things that Hubin's trying to apply those to, with a very quick view, is a whole range of very interesting interventions, from decentralized accelerators to heritage trails, to interactive street furniture, or rehabilitating courtyards to be co-working spaces. So the sheer diversity is really interesting. And the little purple question there, it's really good to be part of this session. So thanks everyone for sharing. And I'll try and finish there. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hand it back to you, Lara. Thanks
a lot, Chris. Super quick and super effective. And as I said, and then it's about having enough time later, at least 10, 15 minutes, to have some questions and to discuss a bit more. My bad, I'm always a disaster in giving times and controlling this, so sorry for that. Arshita and Ignas, do you want to move forward so that we have a response from T-Factor as well?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I will speed up as well. So I'll try to make the combined presentation not more than 10 minutes. Harshita and me are responsible for the impact assessments for the T-Factor project that Laura has introduced at the beginning of the webinar. So T-Factor seeks to unlock the transformative potential of temporary use in urban regeneration. At T-Factor, we want to achieve outcomes and impact in multiple ways. Therefore, we needed to measure and analyze these outcomes on 3 different layers. Firstly, we have the mission level of T-Factor, which is the micro level of meanwhile activities. So they are the real activities on the ground. Examples are guided tours, workshops, discussions, etc. Secondly, we have the pilot level, which is the meso level of the master plan and of the regeneration project. So an orchestration of meanwhile activities can go beyond specific results at a single temporary use, which will affect the master plan or capacity of the developers. And then lastly, we have the transnational level, which is the macro level of T-factor. It is the impact T-factor has on other regeneration projects in terms of creation of knowledge, practices, and capacity. We used the theory of change and the outcome mapping methodology to specify our theoretical framework towards the local context of the different pilot cities. We've identified in a collaborative way the different missions of the pilots and created related outcome proxies through the outcome mapping methodology. Given this, we've created the monitoring and evaluation process for the different layers of the theory of change. Next slide, please, Harshita. Now, we've finished the first reporting period as we've established the midterm impact report of the project in December 22, so 1 month ago. While writing the report, we've noticed some pain points or bottlenecks in our monitor evaluation process. Firstly, as we've opted to use the outcome mapping methodology for our monitoring process, and given the benefits of this approach with advantages such as the strategic learning part, we've noticed that we've really focused on the outcomes of these activities as such and did not take the process much into account. We mean by process, for instance, all the preparatory activities that the pilot cities needed to do in order to let a certain activity happen. Thinking in terms of outputs and outcomes only risk returning a heavily limited picture of what was really happening on the ground, especially when projecting the results towards the long run of urban regeneration. What we have learned in this reporting period is that the most interesting and valuable insights usually emerged from peer discussion and critical reflection and through stories captured on the site from both the local coalition, so the persons who are executing the activities and guiding the pilot cities, and let's say the beneficiaries or stakeholders really on the ground. While a lot of effort has been put on evaluating and assessing single activities, the return in terms of learning and understanding of the pilot's process and progress was limited and often worked better through, as I said, discussion. Therefore, it's really important for us to hear as much as possible different voices to capture and analyze a complete overview of what is happening on the ground and to measure the effectiveness of these initiatives. However, the planned adjustment that we want to implement in this period comes with potential risks as well. These are the following. Capturing different voices and stories could bring more complexity to our monitor evaluation process, which will be much more time consuming. Lastly, the process risks to become a reporting and project management process rather than an evaluation process as such. So we need to find a healthy balance between capturing stories of the different stakeholders and acquiring relative objective evidence of the beneficiaries of the activities. Now I will give the word to Ashita.
Thank you, Ignace. Can you see the next slide?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yes.
So I will be super fast because I will be echoing what has been said already by the other speakers. So the next big challenge that we have in T-factor is proving the added value or the additionality of mean values as a practice within urban regeneration. So these 2 points relate to the aspect of measurement and the aspect of attribution. Since mean values they occur in such a complex and a dynamic environment where there are multiple social economic factors are at play that are often interconnected and they influence each other. And also the context in which we are operating, the urban regeneration agenda itself has a nature of a long a long-run nature with multi-sectorial or multi-layered objectives and ambitions, and the fact that there are so many actors involved within the system. So it's really difficult to isolate effectively the indirect and the direct effects of mean value uses as a practice, and to prove this causality when it comes to reporting, so that how can we attribute the sole impact or the effect that we have measured to the practice of mean value intervention, and how can we not say it can be also the contribution of other broader regeneration efforts or other factors that are ongoing, such as the economic development or changes in the public policies, etc. So that there is a problem first of the measurement, and then the problem of attribution. And another aspect that links attribution is understanding how can we attribute these effects in the long run. So how can we say that the mean value interventions that we're doing can sustain the same impacts over time and demonstrate these impacts, especially when it comes to measuring the intangible effects of these activities. So proving that there will be increased social cohesion or increased sense of belonging over time. So demonstrating those effects is a challenge, because the attribution mechanisms that we use now, they rely more on the quantification aspect or the aspect of proving the outcomes. So understanding those effects in the long run is proving a challenging aspect for us. So that's the key problem of attribution for us now. And the third part is related to the problem of inclusive evaluation. And it also goes back to the point of Maro, where she was explaining about understanding the assumptions of different stakeholders and actors of the community and people involved. So this approach is very useful for us in terms of understanding different perceptions and perspectives for improving the understanding of mean values and its potential to solve urban challenges, let's say. But speaking from a practical standpoint of view, when it comes to applying it, it's an exhaustive approach that requires a commitment to involving a lot of stakeholders, gathering data from a variety of sources, and more so being flexible in your evaluation approach. So being able to adapt quickly as and when needed, when you need to take into account the needs or the perspective of different stakeholders. So in practical point of view, it is very demanding in terms of resources, time, and energies. So this is a challenge, and we need to find a correct balance to address this. And now I will just leave you with some focal points that we came up with from our last midterm reporting process, that what makes more sense for us moving forward. So first point is to focus on the process and pathways of change rather than focusing on the outcomes. So moving forward, when we will design our tools, we will try to focus not only on the effectiveness of the outcome within the target groups, but rather understanding how and why that outcome was achieved, or why not that outcome was achieved. So we will add a layer of process-based reflections within our tools. And again, we will give more emphasis on the qualitative insights in understanding what stories can be used as an evidence or turned into practice, which can be scalable in other regeneration scenarios, and including different external voices in the evaluation, because this can help us improving the added value of meanwhile uses there, but still we have to find the correct balance in doing so. And lastly, as Ignas mentioned, that we need to give more emphasis on the critical reflections and peer learnings as we go on, because this can help us in really readjusting and reorienting our approach as we go on for better. So that's it from the factor. I hope I was short. Yeah.
Super. Thanks, guys. And thanks a lot for being so straight to the point. And thanks to all the speakers. So now it's time really to open a bit the discussion, although we don't have a lot of time. We have heard many things. So really a matter of what is the understanding behind impact assessment? What is the type of change that we aspire for? How do we measure it? And more than that, how can we create actionable monitoring and evaluation systems that we can really sustain in the complexity of the projects? So many different, I would say, challenges and topics related to impact assessment. Are there questions or, I don't know, reflections that someone wants to share? Pablo, yeah. Nice to see you, by the way.
Hi. Yeah, nice to see you all here. Very nice to listen to the presentation. Thanks a lot for everything that was presented. Super interesting. A lot of food for thought. I wanted to ask something in relation to the this idea of inclusive evaluation that T-Factor presented, but that has also been presented by all the different speakers, and that Maro also introduced in the first presentation. And we are, in all the three projects, we are talking about cities, we are talking about or city districts or central historic centers, and that involves a lot of complexity and stakeholders and different visions on what's the desired change, right? It's very different to understand the change that we want in a very small scale than in a district or something where there are like a lot of different visions. And I wanted to ask in order to have this understanding of the change, who do we need to sit at the table in terms of representativeness of the change, of the idea of change that we have for the city, but also I don't know how in terms of also the method that we use. So if Alex mentioned the idea of boundary partners, so how do we set up these boundaries? How do we say, okay, this change is influenced by all these sectors, we need to sit all these sectors at the table and we need to discuss about what's the desired change, and then by this method that we have set up, then we measure it, we set up the tools, etc. So the idea is, or the question is, how do we set up the boundaries and who do we sit at the table in order to discuss the desired change? Could be a general reflection or an answer directly from the experience of the project. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Super excellent question, Pablo. Maybe Alex or Chita, I don't know. You want to start first? Alex, I don't know, maybe you?
Yeah, I can try my hand. So of course, there's no straightforward answer to this question, is it? But going back to the mayor example that Maro was using, so I think one way is trial and error. So you call the mayor a couple of times to sit on the table. If he or she doesn't come, then the boundaries are before that. So you have to sit people on the table that can influence that. And for me, the important focus is that it's not about including everything yourself and making this grand master plan of inclusion, rather than understanding what things need to be set in motion, who are the people that might be influenced, and then be ready to lose control for these to take place. But of course, you need to monitor continuously what are the blind spots and what are the inefficiencies that occur in the process. So I think, as it was mentioned in the last presentation, understanding the process is much more important than the outcomes, because the outcomes can be like serendipitous or just coincidental, or it might not do justice to the efforts put. Like if there's, let's say, a pandemic or a climate event, and yeah, but more things could happen in the long run, even if the project didn't really achieve anything in its life cycle.
Yeah. Chita, you want to elaborate a bit?
I think all points were covered, but I just want to add maybe one point, that from inclusive evaluation, it's good to understand the indirect or the direct impact your activities are causing to which target group, and at least try to involve the voices of those people within your evaluation. So just to narrow it down and not reaching out to everyone, let's say, but try to understand who are the people indirectly or directly impacted, and trying to include their voice as much as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. I see Carolina, you have a question maybe.
Yes, thank you. It's a very quick question and or reflection to all of us, but and I don't know who the three presenters could reflect on that, but I take the picture that I saw from Maro's presentation. People with a paper written, now that the neighborhood is better and everything's better, why do we have to move? Why do we have to leave? And my question on that sense is all the evaluations relating to the goals, the impacts and the outcomes that we've been doing with this project, where do these negative impact fit? What do we do with that? Because of course we discuss the good impacts and we show and report the good impacts, because of course those are the ones that will help us achieve our goals. But in order to improve, to include, or to change, or to, I don't know, reevaluate the direction of our goals, maybe we would also have to discuss some of these negative impacts. And of course, the most talked about is gentrification, but and that's why that picture for me is so strong. It's a question, reflection. I don't know who can. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Maybe I will redirect this to both Maro and Chris. Chris, you want to start first, maybe? I think Chris, okay. Maybe Maro, you want to share a bit of your experience with that?
Yeah, sure. Just to say, like, I'm so happy I'm here, and I've learned so much from, I mean, with Alex, we've talked a lot, but also from like Harshita and Chris and all the presentations. And because, as I said before, like, I was used to apply these things in things like refugee rights or access of women to reproductive rights. And somehow you open my world to the level of complexity to things that might look more simple from outside, no? Because they have to do maybe with the neighborhood, or so it's really fantastic. And just want to make, maybe respond to first to Carolina, make a point for the partner and the boundary question that Pablo made earlier. I think, Carolina, that's a really good point, very, very good point. And I want to mention there's another part of impact, which is positive impact, preventing negative impact. So there is something about how the projects or different projects stop things from getting worse. So this is also something like to say that, okay, we didn't see the things we were expecting, liking, love to see, but actually in the meantime, those 6 months, there was a process of eviction in a neighborhood or something negative we didn't expect. And we were part of, or with our actions, or we hope we were part of stopping that bad thing from happening. And this is something in the level of emergence that Alex talked about. And then there is what, Carolina, what you talked about actually doing no harm. And it's very hard to know with us, Harshita, with indirect outcomes. You never know, and just what these actions and interventions will lead to down the line. And just to give an example, like when Amnesty opened the office of the organization in Russia, which has now been closed, it was a very big conversation. Like, will we create more damage than good? Because human rights activists in the country will appear to be associated with a global organization. They will be more targeted by authorities. And it did happen to a certain extent, right? And again, there is no perfect answer there. But I think putting that question there and trying to keep monitoring answers to that question is absolutely necessary for doing ethical work. So thank you for raising it. And I think on Pablo's point, that other approach to boundaries of, like, if we want to do participatory assessment, if we want to understand multiple views, what are we going to do? Are we going to talk to everyone? And I think one of the answers there is to make sure you periodically speak to people that have very different views about how change happens, that see that same landscape from a very different angle. That's the one thing. And maybe sometimes enemies, you know, what would you call an enemy to your vision? And the second thing I think to say is about, again, I really like, Alex, what you said about the approach of seeing capabilities for change. Like, these things are so dynamic. We don't know where positive impact will come from, but we can build the capabilities we think are necessary for impact. And some people in our teams, in our worlds, are nerds about this thing. You know, they love to have the conversation we're having today. I love having this conversation. And some people, as a very good, one of my best colleagues ever at Amnesty, used to say, I have a strategy. It's called doing things. You know, she was such a doer. You know, she would just keep creating things from zero, like new interventions, new projects. And some people love taking that reflective look. So we need to try to involve diverse views. But then, you know, the people that will both enjoy and engage with these kind of discussions, bring them on board, bring them at the table, because they will try to give their best. And that's a good starting point, because there will never be And just the last thing, because I won't take the world, I won't speak again because I know we're running out of time. I feel like the more and more that the perception of the world is becoming more relational, take it like from quantum physics to like feminist theory, to like the more we understand the world as relational, and this will become common sense, I believe, in the coming decades, that push to be able to prove or to be able to talk about like accountability and the things that some of the last will anyway wither away, because we will understand that the process of trying to attribute a certain change to a certain actor is ontologically impossible. Like it's not going to work. So I feel like we're going to see a lot of changes in understanding impact in the coming decades, and we can be part of creating those changes rather than trying to fit in knowledge models of the previous century. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maro. As we are running, really, we are running out of time. So maybe I will launch very last point for collective reflection and feedback from the speakers, but open to anyone here today. Because to me, I mean, most of the time, the problem is that we are trying to do our best despite of. And to me, this despite of has much to do with the way these big horizon projects, but kind of programs are designed most of the times, right? Because what they expect from each project is to basically solve the worlds alone in 4 years with a lot of complexity. We are saying here that we need to be flexible and look at the emergency and try to adapt in a situation when most of the time you cannot change activities, you can hardly change budget, you can hardly be flexible. So my question really here is if we could imagine or suggest some very practical improvements in the way these programs are designed, and again, designed for impact, what we would suggest, where we do see opportunities for better investing in research and innovation, in this case for urban regeneration across Europe. Hope my question is clear somehow. And whoever wants to respond, yeah.
I don't mind responding there, and sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out. It's Chris here. I do agree with you, and I love this session. So thanks again for everyone organizing it and participating. To your point, yeah, there's something maybe about the flexibility of what constitutes an impact assessment, at least in terms of you're saying the grand visions and the grand ambitions so broad with limited effort. What are the expectations on what can meaningfully be done, I guess, and how kind of concrete are the indicators baked into the project at the start versus how flexible can they be as the projects evolve to kind of find out the right balance and all the brilliant stuff people have shared about qualitative insights. That's just a quick thought from me.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I don't know, any points on that, Maro, also from your experience in designing programs in Amnesty, if you want to share.
No, I think let's see if there's anything other colleagues want to contribute from the other projects.
I can make 2 quick suggestions. Also looking at, we're at the beginning of a paradigm shift, indeed, as Maro already hinted, also on European level. Especially, I don't know if you've read some developments on the European Research Council guidelines for evaluation and so on. We're kind of shifting away of this technocratic approach in assessing researchers based on, like citations and impact factors and stuff like that, and maybe look at the content of the things we've written rather than how many people referred to them. And there's a lot of consensus on that, and I think impact assessment will gradually shift to it. 2 points that I can think right now that have been discussed before is, one, I often speak about this difference between evidence-based approaches and evidence-informed. So it's evidence is useful to guide our decision making, but at the end of the day, the important thing is the structure of the decisions that we make, who have agency in participating there, how are the evidence gathered but also interpreted, and at every step of the way, as it was discussed, being aware of one method not being, like exact science. We need to work with people, and we need to be aware that the evidence comes from people, especially in social contexts. We don't run experiments in clinical environments. And the second one is that thing that we discussed, that focusing on outcomes and processes. So looking at the processes conveys more understanding. It is where the learning is placed. But in assessing EU projects in general, there is the opposite tension that a lot of the reporting on, especially on Horizon projects, is focusing on the procedures rather than the outcomes. So it's, attribute every cent that we have spent by attributing to a timesheet of the working effort of one person in a specific place and time, which we all know doesn't really say anything. I mean, am I now working on the time slot or not? Maybe later when I have a good idea. So the thing is, one suggestion on EU level, if we have any say on that, would be that maybe become a bit lean on how procurements are made and how budgets are being shifted and shaped, and look a bit at the evidence of what actually happened on the ground. Ask the people, do you think T factor has made a positive contribution to your community? And if there appears to be an overtly positive result from different stakeholders with diverging views, then that must have been something positive. So give these people some slack, let them pay the rent or something like that.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I agree. So guys, I think we need to close. Thank you very much for joining and for staying a bit longer. Thanks, Maro, for the great presentation. And if you don't mind, I think we would like to invite you again to maybe follow up and keep on this important discussion. Thanks a million to all the speakers. So Chris, Sarshita, Ignas, Alex.